All right, today we are going to be doing something here at Expedition Ranch which we have never done before. We probably won't do a ton of, although I still want to discuss this topic. Today we are going to be discussing the big beautiful bill, the 3 million acres of land that was proposed to be sold off. Now, as of recording this video, we went off of the information that was live of June 20th. Now the bill has changed. We have Senator Mike Lee, who has kind of been leading the charge on this very controversial bill to sell off these public lands. He has backed off quite a bit, and it's because there's a couple of senators in Idaho who oppose this bill, and so they've walked it back. It looks like now it's not National Forest Service land and BLM land. It looks like it is just BLM land, and it looks to be 1.2 million acres for the purpose of affordable housing. Now, this issue has united everyone from hippies out in the mountains to the backcountry hunters. The whole outdoors industry has seemed to come together and have a very strong position on this bill. Everything I've seen on social media for the past several weeks has just been saying, call your senators and oppose this bill. I haven't seen anything that really is any different than that. Now, I'm a very skeptical person, so when I see things like this getting passed around through social media and there's only one stance on it, I know that that's really rare. And I know as a creator that the things that have really big, bold claims tend to be the things that get likes, shares, that it feeds the algorithm so it gets out there. And that's how misinformation is spread. Now, I'm not saying that misinformation is truly what's going on here, although there is some misinformation going around the internet right now. And I want to clarify my stance on this is that I'm someone who loves vehicles. I love these vehicles, and I also love the public lands that we get to explore them on. I don't want to see public land get sold off, especially 3 million acres for the stated purpose of housing seems like a lot. Now, while I haven't discussed this as much as I would like to in the past, Expedition Ranch is involved in some of these issues. That's what we support through our sweepstakes, through the builds that we do, giving anyone the chance to win one of these things. We build it into our business model that we donate a minimum of 10% to public land causes, whether it's uncontroversial cleanups, trail maintenance, stewardship, education. Those things are not controversial, but the thing that is controversial tends to be policy. But I also believe that policy is really important to help keep public lands open. Now, in our first sweepstakes for the Adventure Camper, we were able to raise $14,000 to donate to 2 nonprofits. And we chose Tread Lightly and the Blue Ribbon Coalition because one of them really focused on the part of education, cleanups, all that type of stuff, while the other one focused on policy. And I thought that was a good way for us to get a well-rounded approach to, see what we want to see here at Expedition Ranch happen. However, the Blue Ribbon Coalition I have seen come under some fire lately, and it's from my own user group, off-roaders, overlanders, van lifers. Now, while I've generally liked the things that I've seen the Blue Ribbon Coalition do in the past, and I think that it has helped protect our public lands, it's kept places open that have been getting shut down, I have seen some controversy around them, through the internet for the last couple of weeks. When I see people in my own community commenting about these things and seeming to not be in support of them, it really made me wonder, what are we supporting through our sweepstakes with Expedition Ranch? And I really wanted to not only understand this bill and some of the complexities of public land issues, but I also wanted to see if the Blue Ribbon Coalition was actually in line with the mission that we have here at Expedition Ranch. Now, the Blue Ribbon Coalition did put out a statement about this bill for the 3 million acres getting sold off, and they did say that they do not support it. However, it did seem like a weak stance, and a lot of their users were not happy about it. Some of the comments on their stance were saying things like, it sounds like Mike Lee told you to write this. And what I did find out recently is that Ben Burr did work for Senator Mike Lee about 7 years ago as a communications staffer, and this is public information. There's more involved there, but we talk about it in this podcast. I told Ben, let's just get this all out on the table and really understand what is going on with the BRC. Now, what I saw in some of those skeptical comments of the BRC is that Ben, the director of the BRC, was saying, hey, if you want to discuss this, come on a podcast, let's discuss it. And they didn't want to discuss it. And I think that the only way that you actually understand issues like this is to have conversations, and especially with different opinions. So I decided to ask Ben, the director of the BRC, to come on and have a deep dive conversation into this bill and some of the other public lands issues that we've seen that affects our user group. Now, I wanted to approach this as skeptical as I can, and to be completely honest, I'm not a neutral party because we have donated to them in the past and we have supported them in the past. But I wanted to come into this with as much of an open mind as I possibly could and try to put any biases that I may have aside. So that is where Eric Phillips comes in. Eric Phillips is a off-road overlander guy. He is involved in local government. He is involved in fair housing issues. He is involved with a lot of wilderness groups and such. And he also has not really supported the BRC in a lot of the stances they've taken in the past. So he is an opposing view that we were able to bring on today. That way I was able to hear from Ben and I was able to hear from Eric. And as someone who is just uneducated about the nitty-gritty of public land policy and how all this stuff works, I thought that was a good way for me to be able to learn. And by bringing this to you guys, hopefully you could take away some things too. You could hear Ben's opinions on these issues. You could hear Eric's opinions on these issues. And at the end of the day, you can take whatever you want from both sides of this and you can help formulate your own opinions, which I think is a lot better than just reposting whatever you see on social media that has the big headline. Actually diving deep into this stuff is how you understand it. And one other thing I wanted to mention here is that Expedition Ranch is a company. We have this YouTube channel, but we are building a brand outside of just that YouTube channel. And most brands, most companies do not talk about controversial issues. I think that this issue is really important, and to a degree I'm sticking my neck to even talk about this type of stuff because most people on the internet will not actually sit down and listen and try to understand. And it puts me in the crosshairs a little bit just because of that. And ultimately what I figured out is that I didn't start Expedition Ranch to just support trail cleanups and maintenance and things like that. I wanted to do my best to be able to help prevent closures and maintain access. That's something that I really wanted to be a part of. So as I was thinking about how I can best understand this issue, I realized that I kind of am coming to a bit of a crossroads. I either go ahead and do the non-controversial things and support those things, or we get involved and we talk about policy. Ultimately, I realized I want to have a backbone. I want to actually stand up for the things that I believe in. I want to learn, and I want to see our trails, our dispersed campsites, and all those areas stay open, even if there is opposing viewpoints. It's the whole reason that I started Expedition Ranch. So anyway, I'm not a podcast host. This is my first time doing this. I wasn't great at it, but I got a little bit better as I went. It was really intimidating, but I tried. This is going to be an hour and 45 minutes of conversation, so I would highly suggest just putting your phone down, putting it into your car, doing whatever you want, and just listening to this. Skip back to a few things. There's a lot of laws mentioned, a lot of precedents mentioned, terms that I've never heard before. I'd encourage you to look those up to be able to get a better viewpoint for yourself. Anyway, I've talked enough. Let's go ahead and jump into this podcast with Ben Burr and Eric Phillips. Enjoy. All right, guys. Today we are with Ben with the BRC, and we also have Eric Phillips, who's also involved with quite a few things in the world of the outdoors. I want to take a minute and just thank you guys for jumping on this podcast, agreeing to be here and dive deep into some of the topics that we've seen floating around the internet for the last couple of weeks. So thank you both for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks, James.
So I think a good way to get started with this is just a little introduction with both of you guys and what your backgrounds are with public lands before you got involved in advocacy and what that looks like, and then what you guys are doing now with, just generally what you guys do with public lands. So, Ben?
Yeah, no, thanks. I have spent my whole life in public lands. My family was in the helicopter business, and so we've been all over the West, from Alaska to New Mexico, doing everything from logging, fighting fires, construction jobs. I would always travel around with my dad as a kid, and so I've probably seen more of our public lands and just been out there in them as much as anybody. And have grown up. I grew up in the state of Utah. I've always enjoyed recreating in them and spending time in them myself. And I currently work at Blue Ribbon Coalition, where we work night and day to keep our public lands open for outdoor recreation, which has gotten me involved in hundreds of agency actions across the country. And yeah, it's been I mean, that's everything in a nutshell, but it's the whole life. So
All condensed into a little bit there. Yeah, I got introduced to Ben when I saw what was going on with Moab and the 317 miles of trails that were getting shut down. I think that's when we got actually introduced. It was through a friend of mine who's actually into hard enduro and is very into that, and he sent me some stuff from the BRC, and now we're here.
yeah, it was good. It was a good introduction. You've been a good friend. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. Eric.
Yeah, my name's Eric Phillips, and I live in Crested Butte, Colorado. I've been out here for about 10 years now. I came out here for a degree in recreation and outdoor education from Western Colorado University. Since then, I've been an avid backcountry skier, off-roader, hunter, fisher. I mean, you name it, I like to do it. I've worked with two different volunteer search and rescue teams, Western Mountain Rescue and Crested Butte Mountain Rescue. And currently, I regulate land use and affordable housing for Gunnison County, as well as dabble in a bunch of different coalitions based around the outdoors and recreation.
Awesome. That's quite a bit. And then, yeah, for me, I'll just go ahead and put my little bit in here too. I grew up being in the outdoors constantly ever since, I was out in Crested Butte as a little kid on my dad's backpack, backpacking and just being a little baby and on his back and seeing the outdoors from there. And then I spent a lot of time and grew up in Southern California, so I got really introduced to the world of off-roading through Borrego Springs, Ocotillo Wells, a lot of those OHV areas, and that's really where it started. And then I got a little older, spent more time living out of the back of a pickup truck and exploring, and then next thing you know, I'm building an ambulance and traveling full time as a nomad, and then got started with Expedition Ranch. Really, after I saw what was happening with Moab, it was an interesting opportunity to do something that I loved, which was working on vehicles, giving anyone the chance to win one of those, and helping to protect those lands that I got to explore in any way that we could through Expedition Ranch. So that's my little bit of background. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what we've all experienced on public lands over the last few years. Particularly with COVID, I think that we all saw a spike in users, and I've not been on public lands a ton recently in the last year and a half, as I've really been working on Expedition Ranch, but I'm not sure if that's cooling down or not, but we got to see a huge spike in people that had never really spent a lot of time doing dispersed camping and those types of things. I saw a lot more designated dispersed campsites. And Eric, I think that up in Crested Butte, you've got to see a lot of increased and designated dispersed, a lot more regulation out there.
Yeah, we have. We switched all of our 7 drainages from dispersed camping to designating dispersed. And a lot of that happened right after the influx of COVID, because we did see a huge spike in users. It was something that was coming down the pipeline anyways, but the COVID bump in recreation kind of pushed the land managers over the edge on that decision.
Yeah, I particularly saw it in Sedona, where they're now, instead of all those little areas on, Ben, you probably know it, is it Forrest Road 525?
I think I know what you're talking about. I've been out in Sedona one time, and so I know they've regulated the dispersed camping out there for sure.
Yeah, there's a lot of campsites out there that are no longer accessible, blocked off, and they're basically putting you in a big corral with 20 other people. And that would be designated dispersed, these areas that they create just for dispersed camping. But it really, a lot of it doesn't have that wild feel, depending on how the land managers go about it.
Yeah.
And then trail closures. Ben, when I got introduced to you is when I saw Moab. And Ben, a lot of what you deal with is closures. So over the last few years, what have you seen with closures?
I mean, there's been a constant effort for probably the last 30 years. I mean, Blue Ribbon Coalition's been around since 1987 to challenge what started then as a lot of broad-based closures of our public lands, and that's been an ongoing fight since the late 80s. And it's one we can say, I mean, definitively over the course of just the last, since I've been paying close attention to it, we've lost millions of acres of access to public land, especially motorized access, tends to be heavily restricted more and more and more as all of the different operating systems in our public land system operate. And so we have a lot of questions about how that's working. We think there's a lot of users and use that's now being restricted that should be managed for the benefit of the American people who own these public lands. But I mean, I can say I became the executive director in 2021 of Blue Ribbon Coalition. And that's when we started tracking our work that I've been doing. And there's a whole history before me. And in that time period, we commented on over 350 federal actions that would affect outdoor recreation access on public land. Some of it good, some of it bad. But that Moab plan that you referred to was just one out of 350. It affects access to 190 million acres of land, all of these plans we've commented on. And so there's a substantial effort underway within these agencies to kind of redefine and regulate how we access these public lands. And it's, for those of us who grew up with kind of seeing what they've been through the course of the last 40 years, it's a hard departure from what they were. And it's something that we think is worth fighting for and preserving.
I remember growing up, I remember that there was a lot of groups looking to shut down the areas in Borrego Springs and Ocotillo Wells. And that was something that we always heard about. We never knew if it was going to be this year, the next year, whenever it was going to be. We just always knew that, particularly the user group that I fall into of, this kind of off-road overland van life community, that there's a lot of resistance for people who want to explore public lands by vehicles to actually access them. We have Moab, the San Rafael swell as well. I remember, I'm not even sure what happened with the San Rafael swell, but that was one of the ones that you were taking action on as well.
Yeah, no, we're actually currently litigating the closure of 665 miles of off-road routes in the San Rafael swell. It was all part of a travel management process that was required from a legal settlement that was reached in 2017 that really started back in 2008. And so it's like when people say, oh, all of this was from COVID, I'm like, yeah, these fights have been going on in the courtrooms for 2 decades now over this stuff. And COVID was a factor, but this has been unfolding over that period of time. And so we're in court now challenging those closures. They did close a lot of the dispersed camping spur routes. And I've been out in that area in the swell quite a bit because we did do a lot of field work to document the routes we were concerned that they would close. And they did close a lot of them. We have to challenge those. One of our biggest claims we're making in that lawsuit is in 2019, the Congress passed a law called the Dingell Act, and it had a portion that was it was called the Emery County Land Bill, and they were going to redefine how all the public land system would work in Emery County. They ended up creating 600,000 acres of wilderness in that area. They did some designated wild and scenic rivers. They created a special recreation management area and a handful of other provisions. And so when you create 600,000 acres of wilderness in an area like that, you've now defined 600,000 acres that are essentially roadless. You have very little, if any, motorized access in an area that used to have an abundant recreation, outdoor, like off-road recreation culture in it. And that was a pretty substantial concession that was made in that legislative bargaining, one that we didn't support and a lot of other groups didn't. The architects of that did put provisions in the bill to say that they can't create wilderness buffer zones around the wilderness area, which means you can't create wilderness type management in the areas directly adjacent to the wilderness. And that's exactly what they did with this travel plan. We feel like they probably created an additional 100,000 acres of land that's now managed like a wilderness by all of the route closures they did around those wilderness areas. But now we have to challenge that in court. It isn't, when Congress says you can't create buffer zones, I mean, it's there, it's clear, plain in the text, but what does that look like on the ground is something that a court has to interpret. And so we're one of the few groups who will actually go do that kind of work and try and get clarity around these statutes that affect our recreation access. And so that's one of the issues we're looking at there, just in addition to like the broad closures that we're concerned about. There's an action alert we have out today. I mean, that we're recording this on, what is it, June 25th right now, I think. Yeah. Is the deadline today that there's an area called the Wedge Overlook in the San Rafael Swell. It kind of looks over the Little Grand Canyon, probably one of the most iconic places to camp in the state of Utah. It's definitely would be in the top 10 list if anyone's making an honest list. And it's because you can go drive right up to the edge of one of these cliffs, have an amazing view. It's like the iconic, I'm going to back my Sprinter van or my thing up to the edge of this cliff and wake up in the morning and have this awesome view that you can't have anywhere else, because I'm a public landowner, and for one night or 14 nights or whatever the camping stay limit is, I can go have that be where I live. And they're wanting to close all that. They're going to close all of the dispersed camping along the rim and put everything into like a concentrated, developed campground, not just designated. I mean, we would be happy if they just go designate the sites along the rim and manage them as designated. They're already there. They're pretty delineated already. And that's what we're asking them to do. But it's like these fights are ongoing. Even though we're litigating the San Rafael Swell, they're now going through the next round of now how are we going to ratchet the closure ratchet up even higher. And it's so we don't ever have to worry about having enough work to do at the Blue Ribbon Coalition.
There's one place in I believe it's in Arizona, Marble Canyon, and there is BLM land out there with some dispersed camping areas, and that was one of my favorite spots. But those spots that you can back up right to the cliffside edges are absolutely beautiful. And I was out there for 7 days, and one other person showed up and ended up camping together. And those are some of the great memories that you get at these places.
And that is what was closed in Moab. Like, everyone thinks that the Moab closures were about restricting access to user groups like the side-by-side user or other. And it's actually not true. When you look at what was closed in the map, it was really like anything that accessed the Green River and then spurs that go to the overlooks of all of those different canyons and labyrinth rims. And so the overlanding kind of vehicle-based camping user group was the one who was targeted the hardest in Moab, but they don't quite recognize that they're the target of this. And that's one of our big concerns and we're still fighting for them in court, even though they don't recognize it. But that is a lot of what's getting closed in these plans when they're finally released.
Yeah, you don't have to be a Jeeper with 40-inch tires and crazy rock crawling to get affected by it. This is people with Sprinter vans, bus conversions, whatever it may be. I think that a lot of the community that I've gotten to meet on the road, the van life community, tends to see the off-road and overland community as something separate. But a lot of these guys, even if they're going down trails that aren't difficult, they're still getting affected by these plans. I think that this is a really good lead.
Most affected. I don't think they realize it, because it's like you don't know quite what's all out there unless you go get involved in the inventories of what's there, go do specific field work around this issue. And so with Moab, one of the common lines we saw after that happened was, well, there's still 800 miles of trails there. Isn't that enough for you guys? And we're like, well, that's what you told us when you closed 1,100 miles of our trails 10 years ago in the 2008 resource management plan. Is, well, you now have 1,100 miles. Isn't this enough? And then they closed 300 more. And now you see with the swell, then that's one more plan comes out and they're closing even more. It never seems to do anything but restrict. And so it's frustrating, but it would be helpful if the groups that are actually the target of all of this knew what they were actually losing. And you're losing a lot of amazing public land experience right now.
I think this is a really good lead into establishing some of the different types of public lands that we have. And Eric, I know that you probably know quite a bit about this. Both of you guys do, but there's different levels of protection with different types of public lands. So if either one of you guys want to explain that and have our notes here, talking a little bit about national parks, wilderness areas, and then going down to BLM and National Forest Service and kind of the different purposes of those lands.
I can let Eric chime in first. I've talked a lot so
I
far.
was going to say, I think Ben is definitely an expert on this topic as well. But national parks, obviously, I think we know what those are. Those are highly managed, highly curated pieces of land where they're very regulated with what can be done there. And they're all managed by the National Park Service. Under that is national monuments and national recreation areas. They are under the same land manager, which is the National Park Service. They're managed very similarly at a federal level, but with a lot more restrictions than you would see on like a BLM or Forest Service land. Wilderness zones, like National Forest Wilderness, are no mechanized or motorized travel restrictions in there. And then generally, I think what Ben was touching on earlier is there's usually a special designation area right outside a wilderness boundary that might share some of the same regulations of a wilderness boundary or a special management area. Um, and then you keep going down the chain into other public lands like the Bureau of Land Management and National Forest, which are open to all kinds of uses, whether that be logging, mining, ski areas, grazing, off-road recreation, regular recreation, the whole lot of them. So you kind of get, as you go down the list, you get more less restrictions on what can be done with the land.
So some of these lands have like some commercial purposes when you get into National Forest Service and BLM.
Yeah,
Totally.
So when we have areas that are getting proposed as national monuments, wilderness zones, and things along those lines, it especially if wilderness zones where there is no motorized travel, if there's existing trails, existing recreation for our user group there, it's something that would greatly prohibit it.
Yeah, usually, I mean, I can add a little bit of clarification to some of the things Eric said. And so wilderness tends to be the most restricted form of land use on federal public land. It can only be created through an act of Congress. And so once it gets put in place, it's also then very difficult because it can only then be removed through a repeal through an act of Congress. And I can't think of a single time that a wilderness area has been repealed. It's possible they've adjusted boundaries before. I know the Explore Act that was recently passed did allow for some development of rock climbing, like sport climbing routes in wilderness areas, which was kind of one of the first big allowances of some kind of a development in a wilderness area that's been where the statute's been changed a little bit of what can be allowed there. And you can have wilderness in either the National Forest or the BLM, and the National Park Service also has portions of parks are designated as also wilderness. Park Service will pretty much be managing anything that's a national park, but they won't always be managing what's are often the national recreation area. Sometimes it's them. Sometimes I know there's forests where it's the forest that manages the national recreation area. National monuments, usually the monument proclamation will designate which agency is going to manage it. There are some that are managed by the Park Service. There are some that are managed by the BLM and the BLM jointly with the Forest Service. And so, I mean, all of this is to say, average member of the public, we don't hold it against you if you can't keep up. But just don't make some of the big mistakes, which is to assume, like I saw a woman on TikTok had posted a video where she was out on like Hell's Revenge in a rental, like on a tour in a Jeep in Moab. And she's like, I can't believe I can do this in a national park. I'm like, you are not in a national park. And communicating to people that you are is sending a false message to people that this is allowed. It's because if you don't, and it's fair, she shouldn't know. It's fine. Like but it is being aware that not everything is a national park, and most of our public lands are not managed at that same level of scrutiny as a national park. And so we should give ourselves some room to kind of have open discussions about what should then be allowed on the things that are not set aside as parks or wilderness areas where Congress has really spoken and set those aside for a specific use.
Very interesting. Eric, do you have any questions to add to that?
No, I think Ben nailed it.
Yeah, I think that we're good on there. We've been able to see what we've seen in the last few years of public lands, establish kind of what these different lands are and what their use cases are. Ben, we have some questions for you, just generally about the Blue Ribbon Coalition to understand what you guys do. Mm-hmm. And we know that just Well, I guess we can just start with kind of the list of questions that I have here. But
Yeah, and some of these
what
came
is
from like your followers, right?
say again?
Didn't some of these questions come from your followers and stuff? Like,
You know what was interesting is that I proposed this to some of my followers and said, "Hey, we're doing this thing. Ask some questions. Like, if you have questions about this, ask them." I have very few people ask questions, but a lot of comments about things, and I think it
sure.
goes to say that a lot of people don't know what questions to ask, and that's and these are things that what we're going to talk about is not the day to day of people that like to go out and recreate on our public lands. They just go
Yeah,
out there, like,
yeah,
like
that's
I.
good.
Um,
Bills, yeah,
so
let's hear the questions.
yeah, so we created these questions. Me and Eric actually sat down and had some of these questions together on this.
Okay.
So with the Blue Ribbon Coalition, you guys have a mission statement.
We do. I have it pulled up. I mean, what I usually say is that we just started a 501c3 nonprofit that's been around since 1987 we fight to keep public lands open for recreation. That's like the simplest way to do it. If you want the thing that's published on our website, we are BRC champions responsible use of public lands and waters for the benefit of all recreationists by educating and empowering its members to secure, protect, and expand shared outdoor recreation access and use, work collaboratively with natural resource managers and other recreationists, support recreation on and promote respect for private property, promote equitable, responsible, and sustainable natural resource management, educate the general public, media, elected officials, and other decision makers, and Eric and James on recreation and access issues, affect the political and administrative process, and encourage appropriate enforcement of the law.
Wow,
That is a
And
mouthful
that's a
for
pretty
a
good
mission
one.
statement.
yeah, I think we covered a lot of bases, but it also is like as broad as it is, it's also pretty limiting. It means there's a lot of things we don't get involved in because of it. And but what you will find is that what it does mean is we do a lot of advocacy with federal agencies. That is where we probably spend 90% of our time. But and all of that participation in an administrative process is hopefully to influence the outcomes of administrative decisions, but also to secure legal standing in case there are decisions we don't like. We do find that there are always a lot of other groups that have different interests that litigate these decisions. And if we're not also in the courtrooms on these, a lot of bad decisions that hurt our members get made in courtrooms, not in BLM field offices or the halls of Congress. And if we're not in court, then we're missing a huge opportunity to advance the interests of our members. And so we're one of the few groups that's national that regularly participates in litigation advocacy or litigation work to keep public lands open. And we do some legislative advocacy as well. I mean, historically, we've fought for the recreational trails program. We have like a current legislative agenda that we're fighting for. And we do educate our members about things that are going on both at state and federal level when it comes to lawmaking.
Now,
So, Ben,
Ben,
I'll just jump in. Ben, who are
Yeah.
your members? You mentioned recreation in general, but like, are you representing Nordic skiers or are you representing more of the off-road motorized community? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. We kind of consider ourselves as big a tent you can possibly imagine. We support all forms of outdoor recreation on public lands, and we would welcome people joining us that participate in all of this. What I've found is most people are like me and you. Like I didn't mention this up front, but I am a snowboarder. I have a mountain bike. I have an e-bike. I like off-roading. I like dispersed camping. I love going boating. Um, I think most people that have grown up in these Western states and in the outdoor recreation culture have a broad range of uses that they participate in. And all of them are under threat of restriction and reduced access. All of them. The ones who tend to get the most attention is the motorized community. And that's what I believe that's kind of a function of how the Wilderness Act was drafted, in that we kind of created through policy uh, this weird pathology around the existence of roads and motorized access into areas. And by defining in the law that a wilderness area has to be 5,000 contiguous acres without a human disturbance, and that a road is the most common form of human disturbance that disqualifies an area from wilderness consideration. Ever since that act was enacted, there's been a lot of pressure to define regulate and reduce the number of roads that are out there available on public land, and certainly almost impossible to build any new ones at this point. And so I think that was kind of probably intentional by the architects of the Wilderness Act, but that's where I think all the pressure comes from, and why the motorized users get so much scrutiny is because it's a direct impediment to enacting a lot of these restrictive designations, that there are groups who want to see those enacted. There are powerful political movements that want that. And so we represent everybody, but to your point, we do have a strong contingency of motorized recreation users.
I always thought that the BRC was primarily for the off-road and motorized access communities. But I want to touch on something that you said, is that the way you phrased that is that it almost sounds like because of a particular definition on what qualifies an area as wilderness area, with there being existing structure or existing roadways, that these groups want to see less trails on public land, so that way we can have more of these wilderness areas. And so there's an incentivization to have less trails on public lands overall. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's how I see it. I mean, and they would probably deny it. But if you read, like, Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance has a pretty good briefing on wilderness on their own website, where they kind of define it as that it really has to be roadless, and that you can't have roads in areas, and that's what makes lands eligible for wilderness. And then they say that the 8 million acres they've proposed for wilderness in Utah doesn't have any roads on it, which is just patently false. But that is sort of where you really get into conflict on these things in court. Most of the legal battles are about this issue and whether to keep roads open or not. But that's like the most common fight. But honestly, with Moab, it was interesting. The user groups that came out, the base jumpers were with us on that, because it restricted access to the areas where they go and set up their base jumping and slacklining areas. I had a group of people that I was out on one of those rim overlook trails before it was closed, and a couple would come out in a box truck, a lot like your ambulance, but even bigger and boxier. And they
Don't
went
call
out.
my old ambulance a box truck.
No, it's like, this is like an actual rental box truck. They'd driven it up from Florida, and they had parrots, like macaws, and they go and fly their parrots around the cliffs. So they have like these videos of them flying these bright red and blue parrots around the cliffs in Moab. And they were like, we use these routes. We come up here every year. Our whole vacation is to come up and fly parrots around Moab. I'm like, I had no idea you people existed, but we're trying to keep this trail open so you can come use it and fly your birds. And so you get out there in the public lands, and I always get surprised by the number of users that are out there. And we think any one of them could and should be a BRC member.
I want to try to keep this flowing here, because we do have a lot to get through with the bill and everything, and we're already 31 minutes into this. And I know that you're going to have a lot that you want to say about the bill, and I want to make sure that you get your chance to discuss that, because this is something that I'm a guy that likes the vehicles and the land, but I don't know a lot about the policy when it comes to what's been going on with these bills. So the day-to-day at the BRC, Ben, if you wanted to sum that up in just 45 seconds or less, what does the day-to-day look like for you guys?
Yeah, it's usually, for me as the executive director, I'm checking in with our staff attorney to see what she's working on legally. Right now we're working on recommendations for regulatory revisions and rescissions, because this current administration is doing a lot to reform the regulatory system that manages these public lands. We are also she's maintaining like at least 3 active lawsuits right now. And so there's a lot of work there. So I check in on that. I check in with Simone, my policy director, and she's the one who basically is doing all of this. These are 1-page summaries of everything we did with the National Park Service, or with the National Forests and the Department of Interior, of every issue that could affect recreation. That's at 350 issues. Every day she's probably got something new, And so we're briefing those and making sure we are getting our comments in. And sometimes some of those we publicize. Not everything we do gets out there in the public sphere. There's just too much of it. But we also try to do a lot of public outreach and education. That's part of our mission. And then there's managing relationships with members and connecting with them and keeping them apprised of what we're doing, and then also trying to recruit new members and supporters is something you do as the executive director. And that's like pretty basic nonprofit work, I think. um, but yeah.
I also see you going around a lot to different plots of land that are being sold or
Yep.
swapped, and it seems like you're everywhere.
Yeah, we do a lot of field work, and that's the fun. That's probably the best part of the job is getting out into the public lands and going and seeing what's actually being proposed on the ground. I got trained how to do this by a ex-Forest Service supervisor, and he just says the second you get out on the ground, you'll know more about the issue than anybody else. And having the most knowledge is how you win and get the outcomes you want. And so anytime you can go get out on the ground, you're going to come in with a much stronger position. And so we prioritize that a lot. You can't always do it in every case. It's just too much, but we do. And we try to use that to also educate everybody on how we're doing that as well.
Gotcha. So, this is something that I think with what I've seen, on social media and stuff, with what you guys have been posting, what you guys have just overall been doing. There always seems to be some controversy with stuff, and I did want to go ahead and get this out in the open here. But right now, with the big beautiful bill, we can debate if it's beautiful, that we have, part of this is the sell-off of about 3 million acres, and we're going to jump into that. But I wanted to get this part into the open here. Mm-hmm. What is your relationship to Senator Mike Lee, and how has that influenced your stance and what the BRC does?
Yeah, so I mean, Mike Lee is a longtime friend. I'm related to him by marriage. I did work for his office, Senate office in DC for 7 years. I left his office about 7 years ago. My dad was killed in an accident, so we moved home to take care of some like family business, and that's when I kind of made the jump into, at that time, was public land consulting. I'd met this Forest Service supervisor that was out there consulting with other public land users, and I told him, look, I want you to be my mentor. I want to learn how to do this work. I care about these public lands a lot. And that was kind of when I left that Senate environment. I wasn't like the public land staffer for Mike Lee at the time. I worked in his communication shop, and so I wasn't actually his policy analyst on these topics. And so it was like, it would get discussed in the office, but this is something that I went and kind of trained myself how to do with a separate mentor that really it was kind of an interesting midlife career choice, was to go work with this other person that had a deep experience and learn from him and become effective at this and go build my own reputation in this field. And every now and then my paths cross with that office and with other, I mean, I've made an effort with BRC that's part of the reason they hired me, was like, I know how this congressional system works. And so I was tasked to go build relationships with other offices. And so that's what we've done. And I feel like I have a good relationships with a lot of offices there, but I am familiar a lot with that office and how they operate. I wasn't there when this bill and versions of it were introduced. I mean, I know they've talked a lot. There were always discussions about public lands, but that all happened after I left.
And that all makes sense. Eric, if you have any questions, feel free to
jump
in.
I guess I'll jump in. So it seems like the BRC is catching a lot of flack on the internet because you take such strong stances against public land sell-off. And when this one came down the pipeline, we didn't see that strong stance against it come out from the BRC. And some people have insinuated that that's because you had a former relationship with Senator Mike Lee.
I would say that's inaccurate. I mean, our position was that we couldn't support this unless substantial changes were made. And that's...
Where did you say that in your statement? Because I read the whole statement and it did not once say we don't support this.
I'm going to jump in for a second on this because I talked with Ben briefly on this. And Ben, I don't want to speak for you, but I believe it was an 8-page carousel post that was your statement. We had the "we don't support this" and how it's currently written. I believe that was the direct quote in the
I can read it from our statement right here. I say, many have expressed concerns that the scope of the proposal is too large. The timeline for disposal is too rushed. The hard acreage requirement for sale is too rigid, and it isn't clear which lands will ultimately be affected until the agencies identify which lands are available to sell. We are communicating these concerns to Senator Lee's office, and we have let them know that these concerns must be addressed for BRC to support this proposal. And so, I mean, that was us saying, I mean, that current form that's already not paying it past the parliamentarian, we never could have supported it in that current form. And so, I mean, we see it as our position was opposition. We adopted a similar strategy with the Explore Act, which was introduced in the last Congress. And this was like a very recreation focused bill. It was one you'd expect BRC to kind of have a stance on. And we did have positions on portions of it. We were in litigation at the time on issues related to film permits on public land. And that bill had the Film Act portions in it that would affect our litigation. Our litigation was creating the pressure on the agencies to actually advocate for that new language to be adopted. And so we were heavily involved in that. And we connected with Barrassa's office, who was the chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee at the time, or they might have been the minority in the party, but he was the ranking Republican, and they were the ones working on that portion. And so we didn't take like a hard position for or against the Film Act because we had serious concerns about how it was going to affect our members. I still had concerns. There was a provision in there which was, it said they must expand outdoor recreation opportunities when making their plans. And I told them, like, that language is really vague. I don't like it. Is there any way we could change it? And so I didn't like take a hard position on that because we were interested in making sure that how that progressed through the legislative process. With this one, I mean, the concerns we have are what we said in our statement. The acreage limits were too high. The timeline was too rigid. And those were the concerns we expressed to the office. I don't know what the new version's going to be. But when I reconciled that with, we do take aggressive positions on a lot of land sales. And this one was too aggressive at the beginning, right? That's why we said that the acreage limits were too high. The schedule was too aggressive. And it wasn't clear from the maps what was being done. And so that being said, it was still a work in progress. That's what we understood from the office, and what everybody who kind of was following it was saying was that this would evolve. And the parliamentarian process with these reconciliation bills is a total crapshoot on whether things will get through. And so in that sense, we saw it as still a work in progress. We still don't know what the final bill will be. If the final bill comes out to be something like the Western Solar Plan. And so the Western Solar Plan was passed through the same process. It was the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed through the budget reconciliation process, had a provision which required the BLM to create a map of millions of acres of public land that could be available to be sold for solar farms, 700,000 acres of them total. We oppose that. If this bill looks kind of like that in its final shape and form, we're still going to oppose it. And we've told them that. And so we're sending them the guidelines. I don't know that they care necessarily for our support or not. But there are other analogous policies out there that we want to see how it benchmarks against those, because then we can make that consistent with our past positions. If it's very similar to what the Western Solar Plan is, I mean, our consistent position has to be that we oppose that because we don't like the solar plan. I mean, we can get into I can make two distinctions about the Western Solar Plan. One of them is housing versus solar power. What's a more important public need there? We could debate that. The other one is how the lands got identified and targeted in the Western Solar Plan is they specifically had the language of lands that are already disturbed will be prioritized for solar development. Lands that are already disturbed means off-highway vehicle recreation areas in a lot of cases. So we saw that as a direct target at our popular public land areas that we fight to keep open. I'm not convinced that the Lee proposal, if it gets really severely narrowed down, will be as guilty of that problem. And so the other thing we're watching is we have tracked all of the exchanges or the sales that have happened under the Southern Nevada Land Management Policy Act. And this was an act that was passed by Harry Reid. And it explicitly authorizes the BLM to sell 2.3% of the BLM land in the Clark County, basically that BLM district office in Southern Nevada.
How much
For
acreage is that?
And so it ended up being like 71,000 acres out of 3 million or something. And that policy has been on the books for 20 years, and they have been selling public land for housing in Nevada, in Las Vegas for 15, 20 years. And we've been tracking all of those. And we watch every one. Like you saw our videos where we went to Wyoming, and we look at land exchanges. We do care that those don't affect our outdoor recreation. And when they do, we get involved. I've yet to see a SNPLMA exchange create like serious effects to outdoor recreation. We usually just pass on them because they're uncontroversial. There are parcels that these agencies own. The BLM specifically maintains inventories of lands that are eligible for disposal that their policy is they want to get rid of it. They don't want to manage it. But anytime you get proposals that streamline the process for them to offload those lands, you get this public uproar that we see here. And that isn't good for recreation. If there's lands that the BLM doesn't want and they don't provide recreation value, it's pulling their resources into having to manage those where they could be spent on managing the recreation lands we care about. And so we are aggressively opposed to mass disposals of public land, but we recognize that the existing system does have dozens of instances where the agencies, I mean, they have staff of realty specialists. So that's all they do is try to figure out how to exchange lands, sell lands, and rearrange the federal estate to something that's more manageable to what they want. And sometimes we get in the middle of that. If it's adverse to recreation, we come in hard. If they're reasonable, sometimes we support them, and sometimes we just ignore them. And I don't think the Lee bill even came close to threading that needle of being the kind of policy that people would see as like in the same boat as SNPLMA. But I do believe that the SNPLMA model is one that most people would point to and say has worked in some regards. And so to the extent, like if this bill dies, we at least wanted to have this be a time where we could refine BRC's process around what are we going to do if these policies come forward? Because there are two right now. I mean, Catherine Cortez Masto, the Democratic senator from Nevada, has a bill to expand basically the model of SNPLMA into Washoe County up by Lake Tahoe and dispose of excess federal lands up there specifically for housing. It's supported by the Nevada Home Builders Association. The Nevada bill, it's supported by, I don't know if that one was for sure. It might be Jackie Rosen also has another bill that wants to do this in, I think, Pershing County. And that one's supported by like the Nevada Wilderness Association, the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, and all these groups that have claimed they will never tolerate a single acre of public land leaving the public estate. They back these Nevada bills. And so you want to be part of those discussions. And so, I mean,
that's something I wanted to jump in and ask a little bit. I need to make sure I jump in because we have a list of things that we wanted to ask. I know that we're getting off. Eric, you have that list. Do you have that list in front of you?
I do.
Okay, and Ben, do you have that list in front of you?
I can.
So I know that we sent in. We skipped over some stuff that I wanted to go through kind of quickly just about the BRC, and we jumped into stuff here with the bill. Something that I wanted to point out about what I saw from just from a communications perspective on what you guys did post on the on your stance of the bill is that the important part of the stance was hidden in the 7th slide. And I think that should have been the headline for your community, because as a creator, I know that people don't read past, it's the first 3 seconds is the hook. That's one thing I've learned. But Eric, if you do want to, because we're already getting deep into this here, if you do want to skip past some of these questions that are about the BRC that we have, we can just jump into the other questions that we have on the bill if you want to go ahead and do
We
that.
can, we're talking about the bill, so we can jump in on the bill. Yeah, I think the biggest thing that that you guys caught flack for was that your stance was essentially so weak compared to some of the aggressive stances that you do normally take on opposing public land sell-offs. So it seemed out of place or out of character based on, you know, your precedent of what you have been or how you have treated public land sell-offs in the past.
And I'm
Yeah.
going to add one little bit here. Ben, you told me something about several days ago, just about
Mhm.
a little bit of kind of the politics to all this that I didn't realize about maintaining relationships with the office. And I think that would be something that our viewers would be interested in hearing.
Yeah, no, it's so with the Western Solar Plan, when that was kind of being discussed, I wished I would have had some kind of way to share with the whatever, I don't know which Democratic senator it was at the time, but there would have been a Senate office that was running the language on that. And it would have been helpful to have the ability to share feedback to them, and just say the way you're targeting lands that are already disturbed by this is going to leave in some things that we don't want to be affected by this. And if I could go back in time, I would have tried to cultivate that. And this bill is at that point in the process where I do believe the Senate staff that work on these things would be open to constructive criticism to groups that have not just gone out there. I do think that the way people reacted to this positioned groups that could have had an effective voice in this to just be seen as sort of like outside antagonists. And we want to be able to at least share with them like which things need to be excluded from this that would protect the recreation access user.
To still maintain influence of these offices. And I think that sometimes if you, like, is it fair to say that if you take too strong of an opposing view on some of these things that they just will shut you out and
I
not?
think it's something everyone has to calibrate every time this comes up. Like on something like the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance's wilderness proposal, I kind of know out of the gate I'm going to oppose that. It's just too far in the other direction of what we fight for. And so a piece of legislation like that, we are going to come out opposed to. I also don't think it has really much of a chance of passing anytime soon. You know, it's been introduced for 30 years and hasn't really, it's gotten a few co-sponsors and I don't see it going anywhere. This bill was introduced as the Houses Act, I believe. Prior to this, I mean, Lee has introduced something like this similar. We didn't take a position on it when it was first introduced. It just wasn't one. I mean, there's so many bills that get introduced around public land issues to track every single one of them. And we are still a small organization. And so and legislative advocacy isn't our primary focus, it really is the administrative advocacy and the litigation. And so we take a very limited approach as to what bills we actually engage on. And that one we just kind of put in the box of this is a bill that it's not, like when it was introduced in the Biden administration, it wasn't going anywhere. Like it's not worth our time. And now that it became a potential inclusion in the budget reconciliation bill, now this is a piece of legislation that has the potential to pass. It changed dramatically from what was in the Housing Act. And once you're dealing with something that is a piece of legislation that could become law, that has the support of a presidential first term agenda behind it, you want to take every chance you can to make sure you've influenced what that could become. And we have kind of consistently said from the start, this is probably not a policy we can support, but there are definitely some things that can be done that would protect the interests of our members more effectively. And so that's why we said we couldn't support it unless big changes were made. And it remains to be seen whether those big changes will be made. If they can't effectively carve out the interest of our recreation users, which have a broad interest in a lot of public lands, we have told the office, like, we probably still will end up as an opposition to this, but they're still actively working through it. we and give, if you're in a position where you can give feedback from your members and community to someone who's going to change policy, you want to make a good effort at that. And
So,
we felt like we could get more done doing that than just joining a chorus of opposition, even though we did join that chorus. I mean, we did say we oppose.
yeah. And a couple things I just wanted to mention here. So with this bill, I'm just, because we kind of skipped past what this bill really is. So it was talking about 2 to 3 million acres, which is a lot when you take it into terms of percentages. We're looking at 0.54% to 0.74% of National Forest Service and public and Bureau of Land Management lands. Is that correct, Ben?
That's what the proposal that got killed by the parliamentarians said. I have no idea what they're going to put in the next one.
What they're going to do now. Yeah, we're discussing.
That's where they started. We know it'll be less. We know that much. We don't know how much less.
So we have that amount of land, which is quite a bit of land for the stated purpose of affordable housing, as well as infrastructure projects that supported that affordable housing. And then on top of that, I think that, geez, I know there's more to this, but this is where I'm not super well versed in that. But we had the land amount, and we had the stated purpose. Eric, what else was in this bill, or what was it primarily that, as far as just the land sell-offs?
There's a lot of things that various recreation groups are really concerned with, and that I've share in some of that concern. A lot of it goes to like, where does this money go to? Is it go back into public lands, or does it go to just pay off tax breaks? Compared to actually, to me, selling off public lands is like putting a band-aid on a budget rather than actually balancing the budget. We're just doing this one and done thing to get us to the next chapter, and then we could continue to open that door of, hey, we did this last time, let's just keep selling off more and more and more, instead of actually fixing the problem of our budget. Just some of the other things that were in the old, not the current one, but the older, the one that got killed by parliamentarian, was who could purchase these lands. It was opened up to basically anyone could nominate lands for sale. Well, it did include places like municipalities and local governments. It also included, there was no cap on that. So, a foreign agent could come in and say, we want this. A corporation could come in and say, we want this land. And those would be taken seriously, which kind of defeats the purpose of this stated affordable housing in the bill. Those are pretty contradictory. Yeah, so there's just a few of the things in this bill that were a little bit
So I think
against recreation.
To narrow this down to a question, why was it so much land? Why was it so much land for the stated purpose, and how did we know that it was actually going to go towards the stated purpose?
I don't have direct knowledge of why they picked the certain acreage amounts they did. I mean, we do know that this was a budget bill, and so they have to have like the numbers. They're making numbers add up somehow. Whether you trust Congress's process for how they do that is, I think I'm in the club of I don't trust Congress's ability to manage a budget. They've kind of proven it's, and BRC's mission, you'll notice in the mission statement, it never said anything about advocating for Congress to fix his budget. We don't set ourselves up to be an organization that's our specialty. In this case, we do see a budget provision affecting something we do care a lot about, which are the public lands. And the budget ramifications of that is, I think that policies like this are better passed outside of the budget reconciliation process. I understand the temptation to do it. Both parties do it. I've observed the Senate as they've kind of slowly marched towards removing all of their minority protections and controls they have in place. And I think there's a whole ecosystem of nonprofits that could be created to try and reform and get the Senate back to what it could and should be as a deliberative body. And that's a problem bigger than me right now. But I don't fault anybody for having those concerns. Our federal government has spent so much money so
This should be
recklessly and
locally recording
irresponsibly. I
for them so
think
we
that,
won't have.
oh, hold on, that I sympathize with anybody who has.
Just repeat what you said for a second.
Do you want me to hold? Are we doing audio checks?
No, we
Yeah, no,
lost you for a second there. But you're
lost for a
back.
second, but complete your thought for about 10 seconds ago.
Okay. Well, I think solving the federal budget problem is bigger than me. I'm with the team of the people who would like to see Congress do a whole lot better of a job than that. And this policy would have a lot more flexibility to kind of. I mean, if you look at SNPLMA, one of its strengths is that it does sell land. And you can go look and see, and they are selling it to home builders. You can go see who's buying it. You can go see what they're bidding on it. And it is then money that's getting paid into the Treasury. But then it gets reallocated and appropriated into like conservation initiatives, water infrastructure, and other things. And and so you can build a coalition of support for a policy when you're willing to kind of build the coalition through the funding. The budget reconciliation process, my understanding of it, and I'm not an expert at it, but what I've been told as I've researched it myself is that they just don't have that flexibility with this. They can really just make the numbers add up or not. And I think that's the first and foremost problem they're trying to solve with this, even though it'd be fun to get in there and solve a whole bunch of other policy problems. It ties the hands. And so it's a difficult vehicle. And so to your question of like, why are the acreage amounts so big? I don't know. I think that they were looking at the budget side of this, and this is one that they really should be. If this is going to be a policy, anything that affects public lands, I want it to be one that is a successful policy. I would hate to see something get passed into law that's going to hurt us. And so it took away tools for them to do that, if we're being honest.
One question that I'd have in here is you said that in your statement about this, that you won't support it as it's currently written for the reasons that you suggested. How do you come up with like a land amount that would be acceptable? And I think that leads into another question of, there's a lot of people out there that are hardliners that say not an inch of public land, don't sell any of it. And is that a realistic approach?
If I could just add one quick thing, it seemed like with your statement that you guys were working towards a yes on support rather than going to like, this is how we get to a yes on BRC supports this, rather than we don't want to see public lands sold off.
And I would say, so let me address both of those things. Let's start by talking about the acreage amounts and what work. I mean, so you have existing policies like the Recreation and Public Purposes Act allows a county or a city or a state to ask for a transfer, a conveyance of 6,000 acres of public land per year. That's been on the books since 1926. And states can use it up to 26,000 acres per year per state. And so if we were just fully disposing of the lands that are available through the Recreation and Public Purposes Act across 11 states, I mean, you could be getting to hundreds of thousands of acres a year available for disposal right now under current existing law that's been on the books for hundreds of years. But that where they kind of build this acreage amount around that a certain jurisdiction can take a certain amount for a certain purpose, that I like that model better. And we've seen that work to benefit outdoor recreation. And so to the hardliners who say that not an inch of public land ever, that's how I can tell that I'm talking to someone who has zero idea how the public land system actually works. And we do take hard lines too. We sometimes hold hard lines on, we don't want to see new national monuments designated. We don't like new wilderness. We have our hardline positions as well. But when these land transfers and land exchanges and things come up, we look at all of them on a case-by-case basis on their merits, and then we look at the filter of how will this affect recreation. And we have found there are times where transferring the public land ownership from federal public land ownership to some other use has benefited recreation, or it has allowed the agencies to dispose of lands that otherwise have no impact on recreation. And so to have this hardline stance that we don't see a space at all for that in the federal land policy environment, that wouldn't be accurate. That doesn't actually reflect the comments we're submitting to the agency. A lot of those, there's been times in the past where we do try to build a public support or opposition around those. In the past, they tended to be the ones that got the least amount of engagement. They weren't the things that people cared about. And so we just started quietly just doing them as we saw them. And we do it to preserve legal standing in case something comes up down the road. And it's because we do everything we can to protect recreation access. And so I think there are models out there where there are acreage limits that are feasible. And so it's not necessarily that BRC was trying to get to a yes or a no on this. We were at a no at its original scope and size. I do think the Recreation and Public Purposes Act and SNPLMA, the one in Nevada that we've seen play out, have all played out over the course of like years and decades. Part of that's because the federal process is so cumbersome to do it. It takes that long. I think that's a problem. I think that's why there are people asking the question, is there a better way to do this? It's a fair question to ask. But sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought, but it's not that we were trying to get to yes or no. It's just we have an existing track record on these specific issues, and we were trying to fit this into the context of that. And this is still a very different animal than when a president unilaterally designates 3 million acres of land in a national monument at the stroke of a pen. I mean, that's a very different policy action. That we have a lot of things we don't like about that, and we just treat that differently. I mean, because we engage on such a wide variety of actions, from administrative, legal, legislative, we reserve the right to ourselves to be nuanced on these and do what's best for our members and to shape what the policies however we possibly can.
Ben, do you think the outrage over this bill from the general public was justified? And what are your thoughts on seeing so many more voices engaging in these public lands topics?
I think it was justified. I want people to care this much about public land. I do. It's frustrating when some of it's based off of what I saw was sort of misinformation and misrepresentations. I mean, as much as we want to parse our position and whether it was consistent, I think we took a lot of time and effort to make sure it was, and that it was something that could advance the interests of our members. The Wilderness Society was an organization that put out one of the most extensive maps and campaigns around this issue, and have really done a lot of work to mobilize people against it. They didn't just support the Western Solar Plan, they celebrated it. And that plan that requires 700,000 acres of public land to be sold to solar farms. And I don't know how you reconcile their position with the Western Solar Plan on their position on this, and they're not being open about it. And yet they're still then out. And that's hard work to do, to reconcile those positions. They didn't even try. And then it's led to a mobilization of the public that I think is kind of starting from a place of dishonesty. And there are other groups that kind of I see in the same boat. I mean, backcountry hunters and anglers support these land exchange bills that are currently proposed by Nevada senators. And so I do concern about that I do think there's a lot of, the public land system is super complicated. It's real estate, it's land. People have been fighting over land. These fights become biblical, literally. You look through global history. And so I'm not surprised by it. I think it's justified. The public should have this vested stake in our ability to continue to access and use our public land. But we did say in our statement, and I stand by it, is I live in a small western town in rural Utah near public lands. And you're in Crested Butte. I mean, these issues are real. Like,
Oh yeah.
they don't have easy solutions, but the affordable housing issue is real. And they're like growing these people want to come live in these rural communities, but there's not a lot of options. And if I've read Billionaire Wilderness 3 times, and there are real problems here. I don't know that this bill solves them, but I do think we need to be us that live in these communities have big problems to solve. And it's frustrating that we are in some ways held hostage by anytime somebody wants to go mobilize a national public campaign around what we're trying to do in our local communities. We have to now go get buy-in from a national political movement that can mobilize elected officials that we don't get a vote for. And that determines our outcome. Like with the Celeste Malloy provision, I mean, people were freaking out about that one. I live in Washington County. I pay my taxes to that county. I pay my water bill, which goes to that water conservancy district. I know I watch what they're trying to do. They're trying to build reservoirs and water storage systems to make sure that this county has as sustainable of a water source as it possibly can. And that's a hard county to do that in. And so I see them putting in a budget bill to convey a parcel of land that they're already building a reservoir on. And unless I can get some like activist groups from Vermont to agree with us that we should be able to do that here in our community, like that's not good local government. That's something that looks more like a vassal state of an empire and not a state. And so I think those that are public land users, you need to have deference to the people like Eric, like people who are working on policies in local communities, because we have big problems to solve. And I do know, I live in Utah. Where Lee is getting pockets of support from this are from the state and local leaders that are trying to solve these problems. It's mixed, there are also people that in other communities elsewhere say this isn't going to solve our problems. I've talked to people in Jackson. They're like, we don't believe this will work. And like, true, it might not. But if we don't solve this problem, there are other problems that are just metastasizing in these communities, and we need to have some freedom to solve those.
There can be two things that are true at once: needing affordable housing, and then also I think all of us want to protect our public lands and don't want to see sell-offs as much as possible. I actually just pulled up Onyx. You can't even see it on screen. I pulled up Onyx off-road to take a look at Crested Butte because, I've been in the town plenty, and looking at that very small town, the land around it, a lot of it is, a lot of the land that's around it does seem to be plots of private land that appears to be non-developed, just private ownership. And I may be completely mistaken on this, but typically developers and such will buy out private ranches and such to go ahead and do developments. Like I watch Yellowstone. I know what I'm talking about.
I guess what you're saying is we see a lot of that. And I guess the point you're getting at is that there's these private lands between where our municipalities end and our forest or national public lands start. And so there's a gap there, right?
Is there a need to sell off public land to get to this affordable housing or to solve that issue?
Totally. And I think there's definitely an argument for that, right? But I think you need to be very, very specific. You need to go in with an X-Acto knife and figure out what chunk of land is this actually feasible on for every party, instead of, hey, let's just, put some pins on a map and say, what map could we do this with, right? And I think that's where a lot of the outrage came from with this bill, was that it was too much. The scope is too big, and there really weren't the guardrails in place to make this efficient. Because we are building affordable housing in Crested Butte. Like we just built 256 beds, 256 units, 456 beds on 13 acres that the county owned. And so I am totally in support of finding more ways that the local municipalities can get control of lands to then build subsidized housing on. One of the issues with that, though, or with the bill, is that you need funding from somewhere. And generally, it's subsidized housing. That's what affordable housing is. So someone has to subsidize it. That usually means that is a federal government or a local government. But they're the ones that are putting up the extra funds in order to make it affordable and not fair market.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm getting at is that not everyone is opposed to these public lands exchanges in terms of housing. I don't think that's a bad idea, but I think the way that the bill was written in its current standard wasn't a good way to get to that end goal.
Yeah, that's fair. I've always, like, early on, I was like, if you could just repurpose the Recreation and Public Purposes Act to have affordable housing be one of the purposes, and so you at least give the tool to the community.
Ben, could you explain what that is?
Yeah, so the Recreation and Public Purposes Act is just, if you're Crested Butte and you have an area of BLM land near you that you want to build, right now you can do it for like utilities and like sewer infrastructure and dumps and shooting ranges and uh, freeway pit stops. I mean, they use it for all kinds of things that are allowed in the act, but it's not allowed to be used for housing. And so, or historically, it never has been. And most counties are acquiring land through this all the time. It's usually small parcels, like 20 acres or 30 acres, and they find them and they work with the BLM through a whole process, and and it can take years. Usually, they lease it first and prove that they're going to put it to the intended use, and then once the intended use is in play, then they usually will do some sort of a sale or a conveyance and transfer title, and that's how a lot of public utilities get built. It's what they're doing a lot of here in Nevada. And so, to Eric's point, it's the way the land ownership patterns happen in Colorado is way different than Utah and way different than Nevada. Like the thing that got me fired up about dispersed camping, actually, I took it for granted in Utah because we could just always go anywhere and just pull off a dirt road somewhere and camp. And there was one time I was driving from Utah across Colorado long before I worked for BRC or whatever. I'm like, I'll cover some ground and I'm just going to pull over off the side of the road in the forest somewhere and camp. And I pulled off on the road, and it was like 2 a.m. before finally I'm just like, there is nowhere to camp. I have to go through 20 miles of private buffer zones around before I get to a national forest area, and all the developed campgrounds are full. It was like, I want to say it was eye-opening, but I was so tired I wanted to sleep. I didn't realize how good we had it in Utah. And that's why I fight so hard for it here. Nevada is very different, right? I mean, they are 20% more federally owned than even Utah is, and so you just can't even have a functional state with. And that's what these Democratic senators are saying. That's what everyone's saying, that they need to be able to use that federal land for various things. And they've built systems that work, that everybody seems to be happy with. And in some ways, and the Recreation and Public Purposes Act, I mean, it is primarily designed for recreation use. And so that's where we see reservoirs getting built. We see a lot of like mountain bike parks and trail systems eventually sometimes get conveyed through this. And so there are good models out there for how we can reasonably transfer these things. And people did say a lot about Lee's bill, that it didn't have these processes explicitly stated in the statute. And
That's what I wanted to touch on.
yeah, and it ties into what I'm saying, because I think it would. And that sounds defensive of the bill, but it's also just based on like years of doing this and fighting lawsuits and seeing, like, the Administrative Procedures Act is binding on federal actions. The National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, is binding on agencies making major federal actions. If it's not, there are like provisions of FEMA where they actually explicitly exempt FEMA from having to comply with NEPA when they're doing certain disaster recovery things. If they're not actually like coming in and explicitly exempting you from NEPA, you're bound by it.
Well, are we
And
rolling back NEPA in this administration?
yeah, that's a different question, and that's something that's fair for people to bring up, is that these policies are happening in a quicksand environment where a lot of the regulatory framework around this stuff is changing, but it'll probably be something like what the Trump administration did before. The courts are reforming NEPA. Like, it's like there are a lot of people that are kind of re-engineering how NEPA should work, but no one's.
I don't know what NEPA is.
It's just the law that requires public participation and feedback and public comment and review, and to make sure that environmental and human impacts are accounted for in federal actions. And so the land sales that happen in Nevada, they go through a NEPA process. It's pretty standard. This is one question I asked the Lee offices about. I'm like, why aren't you guys have it in there? Like, it's binding. It's assumed. And I might have led them. I just said, isn't it just assumed that NEPA is implied? And they're like, yeah, it is. And I checked that against multiple sources. I can't find anybody that can give me a compelling, legal reason why NEPA wouldn't be binding on these actions.
So when we talked about some of the guardrails that are in place with the selection, the 250 million acres is the actual amount of BLM and National Forest Service land that's in these states, correct?
Well, no. This is
No.
what's been identified as what could be a potentially to be sold. So it's not everything we have, right? But these are select parcels that they say, hey, we can choose the 3.3 million from this greater map of already selected parcels. Ben,
Okay.
correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Kind of, but I would the way I think this would actually work if this policy became law is the agencies are required by the law to produce a map of eligible parcels. Until they fulfill that requirement under the law, there is no actual map. We can speculate a lot about what might be included there, but there's no reason to believe they would come up with a map that includes all of the parcels that actually fit the legal descriptions of what's available. That's not what they did with the Western Solar Plan. And what they did with the Western Solar Plan was just kind of identify like 4 different alternatives of maps that kind of loosely met the criteria that was being called for in the proposal. And that's what I think they would have done. I think we would have ended up with an implementation regulation where they identified the maps of these are what's available. And that's just me reading tea leaves. Nobody told me that's how it would work, but it's just how I've seen it work, how I believe agency staff are kind of creatures of habit. I think they would fall back on a process they've already done before. And I think we would have ended up with maps that the public could evaluate. And there would be a process whereby different interest groups could go and then look at those maps and say, hey, it looks like you're including this. You should know this is there, and we have a problem with that. And I think and so there would have been, and the Western Solar Plan, they wanted to make 58 million acres available for solar development, and it ended up being only 31 million that was available as an option. And then out of that, your pool, you can identify 700,000 acres that would actually be developed. And
so when we see these images of, the problem with social media is that the things with the big headlines, they get the clicks, they get the shares, they get the attention, and that's how misinformation can get spread. I'm seeing all these images. I have no idea if it's misinformation or not, of some beautiful places up in Colorado. I can't think of them directly offhand right now, but places that make no sense for affordable housing. And I'm seeing these images, people saying, Mike Lee wants to sell off these particular plots. So is some of this misinformation for sure, or is it kind of stretching the truth, or neither?
I've seen all the above, James, because some people are posting pictures of national parks and saying these are at stake, and it's no, that's total misinformation. Those are ruled out of the bill. But on other hands, the bill could have been a lot more explicit on what was on the chopping block and what wasn't allowed. And the way it was written, it did allow some places that are, very scenic, not good for housing, and are highly loved by the public, which is why it drew so much public outcry.
That makes a lot of sense. And what we were talking about with NEPA, now that I understand what it is, so that's the public comment process. Is it existing law, or is it existing precedent? Okay.
Yeah, it's been on the books since 1970. And so
I want to know if NEPA, just because it wasn't exclusively put into the bill, if it would still apply to the process of identifying these lands. If that's one of the guardrails that's in place.
I think it would. And I would be the first one to be in court if it needed, if they claimed otherwise. So, because this is how I believe it would work. The agency would develop an implementing guideline or regulation, probably something through the Federal Register, probably on an accelerated timeline, because this administration is doing NEPA process as fast as anyone's ever seen it. But that would still be a public process. And anytime you go through a NEPA process, you now also have invited a process where the courts can come in and scrutinize. And so if they really tried to pull a fast one, a group like BRC or any of the other groups that are watching this would go and litigate the implementing regulations and say, hey, these are not working. These are hurting us in some way, and we want to get an injunction. We want to challenge this, and that is common. There would be litigation pressure on this, especially if they got too creative, like if they put a lot of things that people care about in risk, and so at risk. And so I think you would have the agency trying to define an alternative that would be as averse to litigation as possible. And so if I were in that position as an agency, I would go look at my current inventory of lands that are available for disposal. And I would say that's my preferred alternative. These are lands that we've already said we don't want. This is all we're making available. And this is what you have to choose from. And if people want to, I mean, that's like, that would be kind of the safest from litigation pressure wise. But anything else that gets added on top of that, you have a lot of lawyers who will come in with the knives out on this one. And then once you get an implementation guideline, because this Western Solar Plan, I mean, that's in effect now. I could go challenge that now. I have legal standing on it. My statute of limitations is long enough I could. I don't like it. I actually think the Trump administration should rescind it, because it is going to lead to selling off hundreds of thousands of acres of public land for solar developments. And a lot of those include areas that we want to keep open for recreation.
Isn't that what's going on with this bill as it's proposed, right? It's not impacting those unwanted parcels, it's impacting our recreation lands, ones that are held very highly by the most majority of Americans.
I mean, but we don't know because we don't have a map. Like with the Western Solar Plan, I have the final maps. And so I do know I can go and actually make a specific claim in court as to what's being affected there. And this could do that. You know, it's fair. Like we will be looking hard at that. And that's why we've kind of said we have to be, I mean, that's my position is if there's a big broad-based mass disposal policy of public land, we will be taking a hard look at it. Whatever final shape or whatever form, you know, like whatever the final shape of it is. And that being said, I mean, we haven't litigated the SNPLMA exchanges. There are versions of this where we don't litigate, you know. But with the Western Solar Plan, the other thing you get is there are also individual plans. And so since that's been released as of last year, there have been, I asked my policy director for the number, but there's a handful of new solar developments that have been proposed and applied for under this new plan that are in that process of going through NEPA for approval. And so we are also right now, I mean, we haven't filed litigation on the whole plan itself. It's more likely we'd probably file litigation on one of the specific applications, because if they apply for an area that has a high value recreation area in it, that would raise it to the level where we're going to put that much resource into it. And so we do so what I've said earlier is we will always look at these on a case by case basis once you actually have an adopted federal policy under the law.
Ben, but isn't litigation kind of working on defense, right? You're waiting till something happens and then you're trying to stop it after it's already gotten to that point in the process. Compared to like trying to advocate for a bill that has more guardrails from the beginning so that you get to an outcome that's more desirable for your user group.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's like a loaded question, because you do want laws to get passed that reduce litigation risk. Nobody wants to go to litigation. That's like a option of last resort is how it's often seen. And so to your point, yeah, we want more guardrails. We want a better policy. That's why we said we can't support it unless there are big changes made, because we do worry that it could include lands that affect recreation, and then we'd have to litigate those. But it's what we've set ourselves up to do, is to be the guardians of that stuff, and we'll do it. And that is what we're actively trying to do, is try to make sure if this policy passes, that it's those guardrails are stronger for the recreation users. It's what we asked for in the Western Solar Plan. We didn't do it during the legislative process just because I said I wasn't here, or I was so new to this job as the executive director. We were just getting our feet under us. I'd just hired Simone, my policy director, and it just was a different time and place, But we did participate through all of the subsequent NEPA processes. And so there still are a lot of times where you can still shape a policy that's not litigation, and to put in more guardrails and more guardrails and more guardrails so you don't have to get to that point. With the changes in court precedents that have happened in recent years, especially at the Supreme Court level, litigation is a defensive strategy, but it is also an offensive strategy. They are redefining precedents right now on a regular basis, especially surrounding these administrative regulatory frameworks. And so we're always looking for the offensive litigation opportunities as much as defensive. So, I mean, I push back on that a little bit, but it's like there's more nuance to it than that. But I think the point you're trying to make is it is an outcome you want to avoid if you can at all costs.
So, building on what you're saying, with all the precedents being changed, especially by the Supreme Court, do you think we can still reliably rely on the NEPA process to be enforced as its old precedent?
I think that, I mean, the most latest Supreme Court ruling was just a few weeks ago, and they basically just said, NEPA has been abused to prevent a lot of development and projects and things that people want to do through multiple use on public land. And it has become a system for the legal industry to really kind of hold up a lot of building in this country. And have you read Ezra Klein's book yet, Abundance?
I've started it. I haven't finished it. It's on on my list.
No, I have it on my nightstand, and it's this is a conversation both parties are having extensive conversations about, is we have to be a country that can build things again. And NEPA is one of those laws that has gotten in the way of it. And so I'm open to seeing NEPA work differently than it has in the past. I think it will be seen as what it is, which is kind of a process statute is what they call it in the briefing, where the agencies have to show that they did take a hard look and that they did evaluate different considerations, but they don't always necessarily have to follow them. They just have to show that they did do their homework and they analyzed things. And so NEPA will be a guardrail, but it's still, I think you'll see a lot of groups litigate less on NEPA. But you still, with something like a sale or a transfer, because it is a permanent action, I think the standard will be higher. If people really are wanting injunctions and they want this to be reviewed, they'll have that option. It's still there. And if people don't think the NEPA guardrails are strong enough, then NEPA probably needs to be reformed through legislation, if that's what we think we need. I think that we've probably erred on the side of NEPA is too restrictive right now. And that's part of why these other conveyance vehicles become so cumbersome and why people are trying to find other solutions to this stuff.
Ben, when we talked last week, you said there were some other guardrails in place too, with the selection of the plots for these public lands. One of them you mentioned was existing roadways.
Yeah.
Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know if that'll be in the final version of this. In the earlier version, they had right-of-ways were excluded. They were certainly trying to exclude grazing permits, but the way to do that through the language in the budget reconciliation bill, I think that got kind of discussed in public. And I don't know where they've landed on that, the mining claims and things like that. And so that actually leaves out a lot of parcels that I think were in those maps that are the 250 million acres. if they're able to write this in a way that excludes those. For us, I mean, we have an interest in agencies recognizing the validity of right-of-ways, and this policy would have created different incentives around whether right-of-ways exist or not, because the agencies need to know where their right-of-ways are if they're basing their disposals around whether right-of-ways exist. And so that's something that we care about one way or the other. You know, if a new law is getting passed that's redefining how agencies look at right-of-ways and RS 2477 routes, and it's going to affect all of those. There's active litigation on all of those issues. We're in active litigation on those issues. And again, that's often why you want to let those issues get aired out and breathe, and hopefully have this policy get written in a way that is aligned with your interests. And so the way this treated right-of-ways, we cared about. The other guardrails, like one I thought was interesting, like we said in our release, that this has more protections than what we normally see from mass disposal policies. That doesn't mean it has adequate protections. It just has more than what we normally see. There were we had in the last administration, we had something called the Natural Asset Company proposal, which was a proposal through the Security and Exchange Commission to sell ecosystem services on not just our public lands, like everywhere, all of nature and the entire planet, into a $250 billion securitized new market in Wall Street. And that didn't have any guardrails at all. That was just kind of like, let's create this new market and go have a trading frenzy on this. And that got derailed. We were one of the groups that opposed that. We had huge questions about the plan to sell conservation leases through the BLM, which they kind of conjured out of thin air. They had very little regulatory basis for it, and that would have sold a new lease, which is a privatization of public land, to sell a conservation lease on public land, and that affected every acre of BLM land from what we could read. I mean, it didn't exclude much, and so. Hold on, I lost my train of thought on that. But it's like, so there are these mass disposal. Those don't have a lot of protections. This one did have, they were trying to define it. It did have this thing where you have the right of first refusal from a local county government. And if you work for a local government, I mean, you know that you guys have a coordination right under FLIPMA and under some of these statutes. And sometimes that carries weight, sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on which administration's in power, or what you're asking for. And so sometimes that's not even worth the paper it's written on. Sometimes it's helpful. And if counties could have had the right of first refusal on the solar developments, that would have been a huge safeguard about what could have gotten included into that. And does it make this policy all of a sudden like a winner? I think it's an interesting innovation as to how we're trying to solve this problem, that local governments are often left out of these federal policy, and whether that gets applied to this policy or others down the road, those of us who care about these policies should be looking at that and saying, hey, that was actually a policy innovation we should be thinking about how to incorporate that into other legislative proposals that are out there. Because I did think it was a way where that bill, they were trying to meet the needs of the local communities out here in Utah, which is, and so I think that got lost in the noise of a lot of this. It doesn't mean like, hey, come out and support this because of this. But if I work in local government, I'm always wanting to know, like, are they rewriting the system to make us more effective in this?
Totally. I think you're bringing up really valid points, is that, one of my biggest outlooks on stuff is nothing's 100% and 0% or black and white. And you can find a lot of good, even if you don't like the overall bill, there's still some good things that you can find in it and say, hey, that's a great idea. Including local governments, that's a great idea. Let's incorporate that into more bills. And I think that's something that gets a little lost in our politicized or polarized political times of finding those small wins within greater pictures. Real quick, guys, I have a hard stop at 5, which is right now. I have to go move my elk freezer, and I have a bunch of dudes coming over to help me lift it.
I don't have a problem with
We've
it.
definitely gone pretty far on this, and it's been really interesting. We had a lot more that we were going to talk about
Oh
on the
man.
list. There's no way we were going to get to all that. um, Ben, if there's it's 5. You got to jump off, Eric.
I mean, I
I
just have one
do.
question for Eric before he leaves. I mean, you've kind of just seen BRC. I mean, we put a lot out there in public. I mean, we don't hide our public positions. But I am curious, like after talking today for a good hour or more on these issues, do you respect our position on this stuff more, or do you come away thinking we're just crazy?
Well, I don't think you're crazy. Like I said, I think there's a lot of good. I look for the good in stuff, and I do think you guys can do some real serious good in protecting recreation. I do think you guys could have taken a stronger stance on this bill because I think there's so much on the table to point out of, hey, this isn't the best. And yeah, I do think you're incredibly informed on all this stuff, and that carries a lot of weight around here, or at least to me. And I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought of where I'm going on this, but I think you guys are pretty respectable with how informed you show up and what you advocate for. And I would just like you to see stronger stances on protecting the American public. Because that's who I represent. That's who a lot of us represent is the general public. And I really identifying like who is it we represent? Who is benefiting from these bills? Is it recreationalist? Is it not recreationalist? And not like arguing or not arguing, not like coming out fully against senators in a bad way because you do want to keep those relationships open. I think you have a more unique situation that you do have really good ties with the senator's office that's proposing this. So you can they'll probably listen to you maybe more than the general public. You have a little more sway or influence there. And so I'd just like to see you guys pushing back on behalf of recreation a little bit harder on this as you have done in other use cases. Because I think you've done a good job in some of those other ones of getting really fired up and saying, we have to stop this sale of public lands. And I
I
know that I think we're in more agreement than we are disagreement on a lot of this, which is good
Yeah,
to hear.
that's where I think most people land on these things once they hear more where you're coming from. And I mean, I think that's we welcome the feedback anytime. I mean, I do, and I can say we don't take the concerns of the public lightly on this stuff. We definitely are hearing the concerns of the public. We are translating that into our own concerns, which we do have in abundance on any policy like this. It's going to radically reshape the system, and we'll do everything we can to communicate those to all the elected officials that will be voting on this and be implementing it. And that I can at least commit to that, and we'll do everything we can to kind of keep people aware of how we're doing that. It's part of our job, and we appreciate you being here and digging into this with us.
I'm
Yeah,
going to add just one little thing to this real quick. Ben, I think that from what I've seen here is that absolutely have the interest of not only our user groups, but other user groups that enjoy our public lands. I think it's a very complex topic that you're talking about. And I think very few people will be able to see all this stuff. But I think it's communication to the people that support the BRC and how to effectively communicate a very complex thing and simplify it to, the average outdoor user,
Yeah.
which is
and
difficult.
I guess
The never-ending
I'll add
challenge.
one last thing. People are looking for leadership right now. People are really looking for groups to come out and be leaders in these times, and they want to see someone come out and really dive deep into what does this mean for them, what is the actual implications, not the misinformation, how does it affect them, and what should we be doing? And so I think there's an opportunity for you guys to step up and really break some of this down and go into the nitty gritty of like, this stuff with local governments, that's a good thing. This stuff about, putting land sales that aren't useful for housing in a housing bill, like that's a bad thing. Or these ones that affect creation, that's a bad thing. Because there's so much misinformation out there, and there's kind of a void of leadership. So my closing thoughts would be to really lead the people, to break it down, and to yeah, to be a source that someone can look up to.
We'll do our best. I won't. I can't promise to be perfect at it. It's a
Of
tough,
course.
tough policy environment, but I do think we're giving it a good faith effort, and we hope people will follow along.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for answering my questions and having this fantastic dialogue. I really appreciate it. James, thank you for letting me join. And sorry I have to run early. I could
Absolutely.
talk for hours on these topics.
I'm
Um,
sure Ben has the Defend Your Ground podcast as well. That's directly through the BRC, and there's a lot more to talk about, and maybe that's
Yeah, you
something
should come
in the future.
anytime. Like, we'd love to get into the weeds on what's going on in Crested Butte.
Yeah, that was a lot, wasn't it? There were so many things in there that just flew way over my head, but I was able to at least pick them up through the process. So, key takeaway number one here is that this stuff is extremely nuanced. There is probably not a direct right or wrong answer with a lot of this stuff, and if you really want to become an expert in this, you've got to dedicate a lot of time to learning this stuff. There's people out there who are policy experts, and that is their entire career is being a policy expert. Me and you, most likely, we are the average user of public land, so we don't know nearly as much about the complexities of this stuff as we would like to think we know. Key takeaway number two is that the battle for our public lands is not something that's going to be ending anytime soon. This has been going on well before I was even a thought, well before I was born, and it's going to continue happening. So continue to learn, try to be curious about this topic, and look at each proposal from multiple sources to understand what people argue for, what they argue against, and that way you can be better at knowing what you should oppose and what you shouldn't, and you can make up your own mind on whatever that is. Number three is that this stuff does get political because it is policy. It just comes along with politics, and we all know how divided this nation is. And the one thing that I would like to encourage right now is that policy matters. So if you look at something and you're like, man, my party proposed this, but I don't agree with it, you still call your senators. You still do what you can to actually see the policy that you want to see implemented get implemented. Don't be afraid to cross over party lines and break loyalty. That stuff doesn't matter. Policy matters. Takeaway number four is that different public lands have different use cases. So national parks, wilderness areas, they have a lot of protections. There's not a lot of motorized access. Wilderness areas has no motorized access or mechanical access, being bikes and stuff like that. So you have public lands that is designated for that type of thing. And that's a good thing because, there is a conservation aspect to look at all of this. But then we also have other types of lands like National Forest Service land and Bureau of Land Management land that is designed to have commercial purposes built into them. That's part of the land management. There are leases, there are sell-offs for cattle grazing, for timber, all sorts of purposes. So when you see some of this stuff, think, what type of land is this going to be happening on? Key takeaway number five is that the stance that don't sell a single inch of public land. I understand where that comes from because if you asked me a year and a half ago if I agreed with that, I probably would have totally agreed with that and just said, no way, don't sell off any public land. This is ours. Don't take an inch. Over the last year and a half, I've come to realize that that's not realistic, and that's not how our land management system was actually designed to function. The feds are always adjusting their portfolio of lands that they own. They're selling some off, they're exchanging others. They're always adjusting this. So land sell-offs happen all the time. And I think what's a lot more important than selling off public land is understanding exactly what parcels are being sold off. Does selling off this parcel and getting this other parcel in exchange, does this bring better recreational access than we originally had? Those are questions that I think are really important and really where it comes down to the nitty-gritty of land policy. Key takeaway number 6, and this is particularly true for those of us who like exploring public lands by vehicle. It is very important to establish the trails that we have on our public lands and get them recognized as being official, whatever that means. From my understanding, listening to Ben and also Eric, is that when we have organizations that are out there trying to say these are not actual trails, these are a lot of conservation groups. And I'm not saying that these conservation groups are wrong for wanting to conserve a wild environment, but when they're fighting to not recognize trails, that allows these areas to get put into national monuments, into wilderness areas, and ultimately that affects our recreational use. So we can debate on whether it's good to have a wilderness zone or a national monument. Coming from the perspective as someone who loves off-roading, dispersed camping, just overlanding, motorized travel of public lands, those types of things do take away our recreational access. And this is something that has been going on for a long time, and it is kind of this death by a thousand cuts type of scenario where the amount of these areas that we have to go and explore continue dwindling. And ultimately, there either has to be a hard line in protecting the areas that we currently have, or we need to be able to expand into new areas and create new trails, and that just doesn't happen. Key takeaway number 7, after listening to Ben Burr and also Eric Phillips through this entire thing, do I support the Blue Ribbon Coalition? So I'm going to take this in a couple chunks here. So first of all, just by listening to him through this, a lot of this made a lot of sense to me. And so just based off of this conversation, I would say yes, that I like what the Blue Ribbon Coalition is doing. And as a caveat to this, I still don't feel like I truly understand everything that Ben was talking about. I still feel like I have a lot of learning to do to really make an educated decision. That hour and 45 minutes was not enough to really understand this. So again, I want to reiterate that Expedition Ranch is not married to any nonprofit. We want to make decisions that we feel are best in line with what we want to see here at Expedition Ranch, which is really maintaining access to our trails, dispersed campsites, and recreation access for all of us that like to explore public lands. That is our focus. So ultimately, it's about, do they align with our mission? Our next donation for our current sweepstakes will not be happening till about September 10th or somewhere around there. So we have time to continue discussing this. And I would love your feedback as a viewer. If you've made it this far in the video, I would love your feedback to understand what you would want to see us do, because I want your feedback. There's a lot of things that I want to do with Expedition Ranch in the long term that I believe can make a real impact, and not just a few $1,000s to support our public lands. We really have some great opportunities here that I haven't talked to you guys a lot about. But when I got started with all this, I never thought that it would be this complex to actually help our public lands. So that's where your input comes in. Anyway, if you made it this far in the video, I appreciate it. And I would love if you went ahead and you checked out our shop. So if you do want to support this channel, if you want to help support our public lands, whether that be through trail cleanups, education, stewardship, or this other side of things that we just talked about today, take a look at our website. We added a ton of new products. We have this I Void warranty shirt. We have all sorts of gear like flashlights. We even have throwing knives on the website. We've been adding a lot of stuff over there. It gives you the opportunity to win that Husqvarna FE 501S. If you don't want the dirt bike, there is a $10,000 cash option. Like I said, it all helps support the mission here. So if you want to do that, I would greatly appreciate it. Anyways, besides that, I hope that you were able to have some good takeaways from this conversation today. And until next time, happy camping.